It's really important that when you are looking at AI systems, that there is a real focus on what the data set is, what the training set is, right? Because that is going to have a huge impact on what information comes out, what recommendations come out of that system.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Artificial intelligence, AI, stands at the forefront of technological revolution. So how do we regulate it without stifling innovation? Our podcast features insights from various perspectives, from industry leaders to government officials to leaders of advocacy groups. Together, they address pivotal questions that are needed to create fair and practical legislation. I'm very excited to have Faiza Patel with us today. Faiza serves as the director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. I invited her on this show as it is very important to get different perspectives towards framing AI legislation, and we need to get a perspective on civil rights and civil liberties. Welcome, Faiza. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Regulating AI podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Faiza, can you, for our audience, which comprises members of Congress, Senate, think tanks, member of Congress staff, and it's a global audience, industry, advocacy groups, can you give them a little overview of your role?
Sure. So my team works on primarily on the uses of AI in national security, law enforcement, and overlapping immigration contexts. And our basic goal is to advocate for rules that ensure that AI systems used by government, like all other tools that government uses, is fair, effective, and accountable. So those are our primary goals.
So fair, respective, and accountable. So if that's the case, Faiza, where do you see the biggest risks from AI to civil liberties and rights?
So the thing with AI, as you know, is that it encompasses such a range of different uses, and so you can see risks in everything from housing to employment, education. What I primarily focus on, though, is the risks of, when the government is acting in ways that are highly consequential for individuals, when they are deciding your immigration status, whether you get a green card, for example, whether your citizenship application to the U.S. is uh, slowed down or it is allowed to go through, whether you get arrested because of facial recognition system errors, whether you are subject to surveillance because some AI system somewhere flagged your social media as being potentially linked to violence. These are things that, really affect fundamental liberty interests. And those are the things where I really think you have really high risks from AI. I just want to say just one thing, though, which is that, you know, it sort of feels like the world woke up to AI with the launch of ChatGPT. But in fact, these issues, as you know, are longstanding. We've been talking about the use of algorithms in predictive policing, for example, uh, in social media monitoring, in all these different contexts for at least a decade that I can recall. So this is kind of a new focus on an old problem.
So, Faiza, new focus on an old problem because, as you said, these things have been there, but they've somehow come into our consciousness now. So, how can policy help prevent some of the things that you talked about, AI-enabled mass surveillance or predictive policing systems from basically disproportionately targeting some marginalized groups?
So I think there's sort of two sets of responses to that. So one is that AI is simply a part of systems and programs, right? So I think at the fundamental level, we need to have stronger rules around how government performs its activities and its functions. And those stronger rules will then translate into the AI space as well. So, what I'm thinking of, for example, is the issue of bias, right? One of the big issues in the United States is racial bias or religious bias on the part of law enforcement, targeting Black people, Latinos, Muslims in the context of counterterrorism operations. And our rules that prevent agencies from undertaking biased operations are not strong enough. Leaving AI aside, the fundamental rules are not strong enough. Similarly, the fundamental rules protecting free speech in the sense of, when can an agency monitor what you're saying online? Definitely not strong enough across the board. So I would say step one is that those basic rules need to be more robust than they are now. Then, when it comes to looking at AI in particular, it's obviously a multifaceted problem. I mean, there's so many different levers that you can touch on, and I guess I would focus on two pieces of it. So one is inputs and one is outputs, right? So I think it's really important that when you are looking at AI systems, that there is a real focus on what the data set is, what the training set is, right? Because that is going to have a huge impact on what information comes out, what recommendations come out of that system. So it's really important to have controls around input and for the government to ask the right questions about what's in the training data, which I don't think in the current systems is a given in many agencies. The second thing is you have to look at the outputs. You have to be able to examine how these systems operate in practice and who is getting affected by them and who is getting negatively affected by them. So I think that's one way to sort of slice the conundrum of how to deal with regulating AI.
So, Faiza, you made a couple of points. If I can unpack them for our listeners, one is obviously the uh, current laws need to be strengthened, as you said, that we have some laws on the books, keep AI aside, whether it's our civil liberties, they need to be strengthened, as you said, whether it relates to, discrimination or policing or things of that nature. Second, you said our inputs and outputs, the training data. Now, you saw there was an executive order issued by the White House, and you talk about the input of data, the ingestion of data. How do you control them? Now, this is being controlled by private companies, large companies, small companies, etc. You are saying the government should have a role in that. Does the executive order, in your view, address some of those things?
So I'm not saying that the government should have a role in what data the company is ingesting. I'm saying that when the government
Hmm.
deploys an AI system, right,
Okay.
it must know that the training data for that system is not replete with bias. So, for
Okay.
example, I mean, one of the big sort of examples of training data bias is around facial recognition, right?
Hmm.
I mean, there have been many studies that show that facial recognition is really best at recognizing white men, right? When it comes to women or people of color, it's just not very good at that. And the reason it's not very good at that is because its training data set is weighted heavily towards Caucasian male faces, right? So that kind of skewing of a data set has huge consequences for people in real life. And so the government must make sure that when it is buying an AI system, it's not buying something that has a skewed underlying data set.
So you're saying from a government use, to clarify, that's a great clarification, whether it is, let's say, for immigration policies, whether it's for social security, whether it's from IRS or for HUD, for housing policies, the government should be careful in terms of the data that they are getting, that it is not skewed irresponsibly, right, Faiza?
Exactly.
Okay. Um, so, in your view, if you were to take that further, because you mentioned some deep fakes, what constitutes harmful manipulation versus free speech when it comes to AI generated media like deep fakes? Because you did talk about free speech, and
Mhm.
now there has been a lot of talk about deep fakes. We've had, as you know, in the primary in New Hampshire, there were calls made for, sounding like President Biden that they should not go to vote and many other things. So, what constitutes harmful manipulation versus free speech?
That is a really hard question. Um, so I think that you know, I think e- I think that people who are concerned about manipulation of media and its impact on our politics and our elections will generally concede that it is very difficult to draw the line between, somebody who is, creating a fake video or audio maliciously, and somebody who's doing that as part of, it could be satire, it could be humor. You don't have to have a reason for wanting to play around with videos, right? And I think it's very difficult to actually regulate in this space, except for a few things. So I think that um, some areas where there is more ability for the government to regulate manipulated media would be, for example, campaign ads, right? Because that is already an area in which there is a lot of regulation about what candidates and their campaigns can do and can't do. Um, Another area where I think it's possible to regulate a manipulated media would be in the context of messages that are like misleading voters about, where they can vote and, the place they can vote, the times they can vote, how they can vote, like mail in ballots, you have to person. Things like that, I think, are more amenable to regulation given their sort of special status in terms of of our democracy. I also think that in sort of regulating in this space, transparency measures are more defensible than measures around, removing certain kinds of content. I think there is a robust debate about how effective it is to label something generated by AI, and we all live in a world where we have many many things competing for our attention at all times, including videos. And so I'm not 100% sure that what effect that has, but that at least provides somebody who wants to know information about what it is that they're seeing. So I think what I would say is, like, I don't think that there's like a bright line that you can draw between a deep fake versus, something that people are just doing for fun. It often comes down to intent. And even then, I think it's really difficult to regulate in this space because of the complexities and because of First Amendment free speech protections. So I think there are these narrow areas where, not narrow, but there are these areas where you can regulate, and transparency is probably the most defensible regulation.
So, what you're saying is it's a thin line. It's sometimes hard to regulate. Now, in the case of political ads, etc., the FTC has come out clearly, and some of these companies recently came out with a political bill of rights saying that they would be very careful, whether it's an OpenAI and uh, Google and others. Um, Given that we have presidential elections this year, there are about 60 countries that are going through elections. Does the issue of deepfakes concern you, given what's going on in the political environment, not just here but globally also, Faiza?
I mean, yes, obviously. I mean, I think the issue of manipulated media, first of all, it's a long-standing issue, right? Like, it's just become easier and more widespread as more and more tools have become available to people and more people are using them. Um, so I think that it is definitely an issue. I think on flip side, it's really important. Public education, I think, in this space is really important. It's important that um, that ordinary individuals who may come across these kinds of videos or audio or pictures or whatever have this sort of instinctive, like, is that true, really? And I feel like anecdotally, I've seen this a lot more in the last 5 or 6 years. You know how we're all part of these WhatsApp chat groups, right? So, like, people post all kinds of rubbish on these chat groups, but I've seen more and more people like actively pushing back, like, is that true? Like, how do you know that's true? So I think that's a responsibility on all of us, and then on us to like educate ourselves about what is happening in the information environment so that we are actually careful about what we rely on.
So educating ourselves and becoming more aware, I think, Faiza, is what you're saying, especially as far as the information flow that is uh, concerned. Uh, Faiza, moving a little bit to more of these companies, do you have a view on what civil rights principles should some of these large technology companies who are building AI systems adhere to in their product design process?
All. I mean, I think they should adhere to all. And I think it's important, though, to sort of, I don't think we should think about civil rights and civil liberties in the sort of physical world and in the virtual world as being two entirely separate things. At the end of the day, we want to enjoy the same rights and freedoms in the virtual world as we do in the real world. The question is really, how do you translate from one to the other? So I think that really companies in developing these tools need to be highly cognizant of the and civil liberties implications of their tools. That is their responsibility to
Mm,
figure out that, look, I'm making this, let's say, predictive policing tool. How could it go wrong? Who could
mm,
it harm? And then think about, ways to mitigate that harm, which, by the way, may not always be possible. There may be tools that simply cannot be adjusted enough to mitigate real serious harms to individuals. So I think that's the main that would be sort of my overall message. I would though sort of pull out a few things that I think are important. So one is privacy rights, right?
mm.
I think, the lesson that we've learned over the last couple of decades into seeing, different kinds of tech tools being rolled out. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, wait a minute, what about data privacy? And it's really late in the game because then they are, trying to add things on and it doesn't work as well as integrating principles about limiting data collection, for example, in tools in the first place. The second thing I think is that it's really important to think about bias. I think bias is a through line in all of the discussions that I've had about AI. That how do you see when your tool is biased? Again, inputs, outputs, right? And then how do you account for that? And I'm not sure that we have seen any sort of credible and reliable kind of um, methods for doing that. But I'm not a tech person myself. I'm just a lawyer. So maybe they're out there. But certainly when you see the reporting that comes up over and over again about the kinds of mistakes that these tools make, it makes you question whether these issues have been addressed, although everybody claims they have been, right?
So you're saying is two key things, Faiza. One is obviously privacy, and then the bias issue. So how can policy address algorithmic bias and discrimination issues in AI without stifling innovation? Can that be done?
Well, so first of all, I think I kind of, I sort of have a real problem with this dichotomy, with this idea that like, AI innovation is here and discrimination is here. Because if an algorithm is biased, I don't care what it does. It's not it's not effective, right? So so I don't think that you can say that something is innovative when it incorporates bias. Whatever it is that you are trying to do, if it is not fair and objective, I don't see that as an improvement. It may be faster, but it's just not working as well. And I think we need to hold that idea in our minds that innovation without, you know, adhering to sort of basic principles is really not valuable to us as a human race. So I think that's the first thing I would say. Um, I mean, think about it this way, right? Like one of the big things that was in fashion, maybe, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, were these algorithms that were designed to help judges decide who to give bail to and who to send back to prison. And it turned out that those algorithms were weighted in ways that they sent Black people back to prison and denied them bail systematically at a higher rate than white people. And is that innovation? I don't think so. I think
Mm.
it's not an effective algorithm if it's biased. So I think that's kind of what I would say to that.
So it's as you said, it's not an either or option. Faiza, we've had many experts who have come in, people from key academic institutions who build large language models, who say that to create 100% unbiased system is almost an impossibility. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I guess a lot of it depends on like what do you mean by bias, right?
Mm,
Because of course we live in a world of bias, and human
mhm.
beings also have biases, which they bring to the table whenever they make decisions. Um, I think it is a challenge for these models to be unbiased, especially as the definition of what is bias is so contested, right? Um, so I'm not suggesting that I think that they're going to be 100% unbiased, but I do think that they need to be more unbiased than they have been from what we've seen over the last decade or so.
Um, in your view, Faiza, what governance mechanisms would enable communities that are impacted by some of these AI systems to flag harms early on?
So I think that one of the big challenges, there are a lot of challenges for marginalized communities in sort of addressing AI and AI harms, right?
Mhm.
Generally speaking, you're talking about communities where their representative groups have a bunch of issues to deal with, not just AI. They're often under resourced, and then you have these sort of like very technical barriers, right? And a lot of people who represent, communities of color or poorer communities um, have this sort of threshold issue about sort of addressing these harms, but it's critical that they do. So I think one way that I would say is that it is important to build an ecosystem of these groups and community groups and grassroots representatives that understand the importance of AI in the lives of the people who they are trying to represent. The second thing I think that's really important is this question of transparency, right? I mean, everybody talks about how, AI is a black box and you don't know what's going on inside it. But a lot of the times you don't even know that it's affecting you. And that's one of the things I think that is um, a good development in I mean, first of all, transparency has been a principle that the White House has promoted since it published its blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, and then again in President Biden's executive order. And more recently, the Office of Budget and Management issued some guidance. It's draft, but it should be final soon. And one of the provisions in that guidance says, well, if somebody is negatively impacted by an AI system, then they need to be given notice of that. I think that's a very important step forward because only then will you be able to start to pull back the veil on the different harms of AI.
So Do you think uh, basically some of these communities that you talked about just now, they can actually work together, they can mobilize with the private sector and academia to prevent some of these harms that we are talking about?
I mean, certainly, I feel like a lot of communities have mobilized, right? And
Hmm.
people are talking to each other and working with each other. I, s- from what I have seen, again, limited perspective. I don't know everything. Um, I think that the conversation around regulating AI is still too centered around um, sort of tech policy oriented
Mm.
viewpoints with fewer viewpoints that are reflecting, that are not reflecting, but that are sort of, really representing directly impacted communities. And I think that really needs to change and become more that space needs to be more inclusive.
Faiza, what kind of communities, as our listeners are, as I said, members of Congress, they're in the administration, what kind of communities would you recommend that they kind of also listen to that have been impacted, in your view, that are not being potentially being listened to, so to speak?
Yeah, and just to be fair, I mean, there are, big organizations representing, communities of color, which is a lot of what I'm talking about over here,
Hmm.
that are part of the conversation. I'm just saying, I think there needs to be more of that, just based
Okay.
on what I've seen in my experience. And I think what do I mean when, I mean, we do talk a lot about impacted communities. Generally speaking, I think there's a couple of ways of thinking about that. So communities that have historically been disadvantaged within a particular country. So if you're in the
Mhm.
United States, that would mean Black and Brown communities, um, often overlapping with immigrants. I think those are the communities of concern as far as the way I see it.
So, different
There are
communities.
also, sorry if I
Sorry,
may,
go ahead.
there are also other communities, right? I mean, there's a whole community. There's also like labor issues around AI, the
Hmm.
issues around creative professionals. So certainly those are additional issues which need consideration as well. But looking at it from the civil rights and civil liberties lens, those are the communities I'm really focused on. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, please.
No, it's my there we go.
Uh, Faiza, in terms of what you're talking about, the civil liberties, do you think international cooperation is necessary from a regulatory standpoint? You see what the EU has done, they've obviously gone ahead. The US is, you know, it's a presidential year. We don't know what's going to happen here. Um, but do you think international cooperation is necessary in terms of regulatory framework for some of these things?
I think it's pretty essential, actually. I mean, I think that, and you've seen that both the EU and the United States have taken steps towards sort of convergence, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, the EU is further along in developing regulation, but if you look, for example, there are a lot of other mechanisms in place, which is sort of where you have officials from the EU and the United States trying to agree on sort of key definitions and ideas and principles. Um, if you look at, something like the NIST has a document on sort of how to sort of evaluate AI systems, and it's not a regulation, but it is also reflects a lot of the thinking that you see in the EU AI Act. That being said, I mean, here we're talking about very big picture things, right? Certainly, I think on the nitty gritty of it, there it will be difficult to get a lot of agreement, but I think alignment is something that is, some that should be we should be striving for.
Um, Obviously, we have to strive for alignment. As far as from a US standpoint, do you think there should be a dedicated or a specialized regulatory body that will oversee the development and deployment, especially for protection of some of the civil liberties? What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's actually really important to have a regulatory body that has sort of the overall oversight over these systems. I think one of the things that I was very disappointed in the Biden executive order was the fact that national security systems are exempted and put on a separate track. I
Hmm.
understand, obviously, that there are special sensitivities about national security systems, but I still think that national security systems should meet the baseline standards that the White House has set out for AI in general, which is, kind of like they need to be fair, they need to be effective.
Hmm.
These are things that you want from every system, particularly systems that are charged with very consequential decisions. So I do think that that's an important thing that needs to be addressed.
Faisal, one of the things that keeps coming up, not just with our guests, but everything I'm sure you've read, is that there is going to be a transformation as far as jobs are concerned. There's all kinds of numbers, whether if you read McKinsey or IMF, they're up to 60% of white collar jobs in developed economies, maybe 30, 40% in less developed economies. Uh, what are your thoughts on that? And do you think, impact some marginal communities a little bit more than others? Or what is the consequences and what should be the role of regulators as far as this massive transformation that could be underway?
So that's pretty much outside my area of expertise.
Hmm.
I think, though, that, and as we've seen over the last year or so, as these debates have been very front and center, is that, the government um, has to figure out if, in fact, these estimates are true. And I am personally quite skeptical that these are as true as they seem to be, especially as you see at least the early iterations of some of these sort of um, AI tools that are supposed to help you do basic stuff, kind of fail again and again. There was a recent article, I think yesterday or the day before, about the TurboTax chat function and how it like gave the wrong advice a third of the time to somebody who's trying to file their taxes. Now, I understand it's going to, in theory, get better, but I don't think that. I think that some of the story about the transformational power of AI is hype, at least in the near term. It may be true in 10, 15 years, but certainly at the moment, I think there's a fair amount of hype. The second thing I think is that obviously, if there is a foreseeable and massive labor disruption, it would have huge consequences for our societies, right? No matter where you live, if it's 60% or 30%, those are things that it is a government's duty to address how it will approach and how it will mitigate.
So obviously, you think you're a little skeptical about those numbers because, as you said, the systems are not up to the par, but the government should definitely be paying attention towards that. Um, what recommendations, Faiza, would you give lawmakers for protecting civil liberties in an AI-powered world? Because they're also coming at it. Remember, they're not AI experts, they're not machine learning gurus.
Right.
They're dealing one day with Ukraine, another day with issue with Hamas, and third day with border security, and all in the same hour.
Right.
So, an expert like you, what would you give them advice in terms of protecting civil rights in an AI-powered world?
So I think there's sort of two slightly contradictory things I want to say.
Hmm.
So one is that, so far in the US, the regulation of AI has been either through soft law, like standards like the NIST standards and such, or through executive order. And as we've seen, executive orders can be rescinded. Soft law can just disappear. So I think it is important for Congress to act so that we have an enduring baseline of applicable rules of the road for this. They really shouldn't be abdicating this completely to the executive branch. I The second thing I think is that I think we have to remember that AI regulation is not a one and done, right? Even if, there is regulation coming out of Congress, which I know seems like a very long shot possibility. Um, if and when that gets done, I think, we are at the beginning of the process of regulating AI. We are not in the middle. We're not even, we haven't even taken more than baby steps in this direction. And we don't know how the technology will evolve. We don't know fully what the harms are. We have an idea based on current systems and current uses of the types of harms, right?
Mhm.
But who knows what would come next, and which ways the technology will turn. I mean, if you take a look at social media, for example, and you kind of trace the evolution of the social media platforms and how they have fared, right? So they started out getting a very generous grant of immunity
Mhm.
for hosting content under Section 230, right? And, the first few years was all, hunky dory. Everybody was connecting. It was kumbaya,
Mhm.
all this love, your friends and family. You could talk to your high school friends in a different country and all of this. And it was great. And then it wasn't, right? And then it became, the last sort of 6 years, I think 5 or 6 years, has just been all about like all the harms of social media, disinformation, teenagers, all of this stuff. It took a little while for all of that to become manifest. And we've seen this in real time, right? It's happened before our eyes. And so I think a little humility in the face of new technology is also warranted. That being said, there are baseline things. Congress should act, and it should act pretty quickly, um, so that the tools do not get entrenched into our systems without some fundamental guardrails.
So, as I'm in Washington, we don't do things fast. We don't even do things slow. We do things
We
very,
don't do
very.
things.
We don't do things. Well, I'll. You said that, but given that you said that we need to act, which is absolutely right, and you also made a very excellent point that social media, it was all great, as you said. We found friends we never could have ever found, through school, etc., etc. Um, but obviously, the EU is taken much faster. As you know, they always are ahead of us in as far as regulation is concerned. Um, does do you also worry that maybe, I mean, when you look at social media, since you brought that up, our town square or our connectivity is controlled by four, five, six
Mm,
companies. Those same companies are now
exactly.
making rapid advances because it takes a lot of money and resources to do this. These are the same companies.
And data.
Yeah, and data, because they own that data which you talked about earlier. Does that worry you that again, they'll be in control, and with AI, they can control the history, they can control the present, they can control the future in many ways. Any thoughts on that, Faiza?
I mean, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a huge gatekeeper problem already with these I forget 6, 7 companies that are also responsible for the rise in our 401k plans and the like. But I think there's a huge gatekeeper problem, and so there was a lot of again, the EU has been much more aggressive in taking on these companies and has levied pretty substantial fines on most of them. I think they fined Apple earlier this week. Um, and so antitrust is, I think, definitely part of the um, way to address AI. That being said, I'm not an antitrust expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly how, but it feels to me that, you know, that's definitely part of it. I think there's sort of two areas which are sort of upstream from AI,
Mhm.
but which need to be addressed in order to address AI. And the first one, I think, is privacy and data protection, which
Mhm.
again, the EU has far advanced from the United States. And then the other one is antitrust and monopolistic power.
Yeah. So antitrust is something that you're saying is should be taken a look at. Faiza, you did drop in a point saying that you're a lawyer, so I'm going to try to throw sort of a legal question at you, and that'll be my last question, but I couldn't resist that. So, if an AI system, whether it's a large language model or anything, does harm, whether it's civil liberties, which is your area of expertise, who should be responsible, the developer of the system, the implementer, or the user? Because that's a question that keeps coming up a lot.
Yeah. And it's a great question. And the answer has to be it depends.
I knew because you said you were a lawyer. That's what the lawyers answered to me on this. But anyway, but it is right. It does. But that's something that will come up or for us to litigate or decide over a period of time. Well,
Absolutely.
it will definitely come up. Any last words for our listeners? As I said, it's a global audience. Something that you would like to share with them, with some of the things that you've been doing. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'd say obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're already doing this, but to pay attention to these issues because they are going to have important ramifications for our lives. As a lawyer, I'm also a skeptic, so I tend to read claims of earth-shattering changes with a little bit of a grain of salt and some chili. So that would be the other thing I would say. And then the third, I would say, I mean, I'm sure most people have already done this. It's actually kind of fun to play with AI and play with tools like ChatGPT or Wally and see what you can do. It is, kind of creative in a way as well. So they are actually super fun.
So be skeptical, but have a little fun and be aware. That's Faiza's last words. Thank you so much. This has been great. There were so many other things I wanted to ask, but maybe we'll have you over another time. Thank you so much for being with us, Faiza.
Thanks, Sanjay.
Thanks for tuning in to the Regulating AI Innovate Responsibly podcast. You'll find links in the show notes to any resources mentioned on the show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you'll never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.